talk, but it seems like we should be a little bit more informal. First, I just want to say thank you so much for coming here. I don't even think thank you is enough. Gratitude doesn't seem to be enough, but I really thank you so much for coming here, coming from New York, coming from Washington, Burlington, Boston, and to help make the launch of the Vermont Humanitarian Forum something that can be real. So thank you so much. Of course, you know, this day relates to a tragedy that took place in 2003 with the passing or the killing of Sergio Vera de Mello, who was an SRSG for the UN in Timor-Leste and in Baghdad. And I guess that tragedy struck a nerve, and people thought, well, wow, we should really pay attention to humanitarian workers. They're risking their lives. And every day, on some level, they are, and the people that they're helping are risking their lives. So the General Assembly in 2009 declared that August 19th would be World Humanitarian Day, and that's why we decided that this is the day we should launch the Vermont Humanitarian Forum, and we hope that this will be an annual event, perhaps a little bit bigger, and you know, it will be the other Switzerland on August 19th. And today we're also going to be discussing, discerning pathways to deal with humanitarian emergencies, because they are all complicated. It's not one reason, and there's not one path for preventing and healing from the humanitarian tragedy. And I guess we were going to begin with a short film on Vermont, because one of the conversations we had coming up here was, why Vermont? It doesn't have any industry, doesn't have any business or banking, doesn't have any military. Like, what's going on here? One thing that's going on, I guess, is community building, a sense of consciousness about the environment, consciousness about humanity. There's a lot of compassion here. When there were refugees coming to Vermont, there wasn't enough people who weren't calling, saying, what can I do? One person told me that he was driving with clothes that he has in his car for a week to give to us. And so we learned a lot about the compassion in Vermont. And we actually, at Grace Initiative Global, became a community partner of Episcopal Migration Ministries in February for the placement of Afghan refugees under the Afghan Placement Program. So we've learned firsthand about the compassion of Vermont. But now I would like to introduce the speakers and some of the amazing people who made the journey to Vermont. And the first person I would like to really honored to introduce, and someone I had also the honor to work for in Timor-Leste, is Mr. Atul Khare, who served as the special representative for the Secretary General in Timor-Leste from 2006 to 2009. His leadership then was not just organizational, but also inspirational. And the testament to that is that I still look up to him all these years. But currently, Mr. Atul Khare is the UN Undersecretary General for Operational Support. He previously served as the Undersecretary General for Field Support since March 2015. With the UN, Mr. Khare brings a wide breadth of strategic management and innovative expertise in both headquarters and in the field. He co-chaired the Secretary General's internal review on management reform to improve the effectiveness of mandate delivery and to enhance transparency and accountability within the organization. In 2010 to 2011, he served as the Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operations and Deputy Head of the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. He was later appointed as Assistant Secretary General for Change Management. Before joining the UN, he served as the Director of the Nehru Center and Minister of Culture High Commission of India in London. Mr. Khare served during his tenure with the Indian Foreign Service in his diplomatic missions in France, Mauritius, and Senegal, Thailand, and the United Kingdom, as well as the permanent mission of India to the United Nations in New York. These few paragraphs cannot sum up his expertise and his insight, and so without further ado, Mr. Topari.
Good evening. Your Excellency, Ambassador Carlito Nunes, my dear friend, permanent representative of Timor-Leste and Ambassador of Timor-Leste to the United Nations, Headmaster Carson Thurber, former headmaster, a distinguished teacher, I would say, even for me. I have been learning from him since the time I have set foot in the Stratton Mountain School. My very dear colleague, Yvonne Lodico, my colleagues joining here or on Zoom, Mr. David Basuni, Mr. Douglas Mercado, Mr. Abraham Joseph, Mr. John Sales, whom I had the opportunity to meet and learn about the good work which he has and his organization have been doing. I think, first of all, let me say that Yvonne is a dear friend, and that's why she has been extremely effusive in her remarks about me. I don't think that I deserve them, because whatever little we have been able to achieve, including inter alia, in Timor-Leste and thereafter, has been due to the work of the colleagues, like Yvonne, that I had the extreme fortune of being in my team. Today, it is indeed my pleasure to join you to say a few remarks on this important forum and on this commemoration of the World Humanitarian Day. As Yvonne pointed out, we all remember with great sadness that on this day, nearly 19 years ago, my former colleague, Sergio Vera de Mello, sacrificed his life as then Special Representative of the Secretary General for Iraq, and 21 of his colleagues also sacrificed their lives. I think we pay a personal tribute to those, all of those, who over the years have paid the ultimate sacrifice, bringing peace, security, help, and assistance to those who need. You are aware that the day was then designated as the World Humanitarian Day by the UN General Assembly to recognize all those lives that have been lost. Today, earlier in the course of the day, Secretary General of the United Nations was in Odessa, in Ukraine, where we are grappling with yet another complex conflict and crisis. Sergio Vera de Mello dedicated his life to promoting sustainable peace, international security, and better living conditions in situations of armed conflict. My own current department, the Department of Operational Support, aspires to be one of the examples of the pragmatism and competence standards that he, Sergio, set. We follow it in implementing support to UN colleagues, serving the interests of humanity and peace all over the world. Whether we are engaged in discussion on budgets, or we are engaged in ensuring medical evacuations of our colleagues from difficult places like Kidal or Juba, particularly during the COVID pandemic, the example and dedication of leaders who preceded us, such as Sergio, always inspire us and encourage us to do more. In fact, the best way of honoring those who have sacrificed their all is to do the very best that we can for the people that we serve. Looking at Vermont, and this is my first visit to this very important Green Mountain state, I think what the Secretary General refers to as the triple planetary emergency, climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss. Learning from efforts which have been deployed in places like Vermont, we also need to continually adapt our operations. Here, the peacekeeping missions will play a central role given the scale of their environmental footprint. And that is why we are ensuring, working to make the humanitarian operations, peacekeeping operations, peace operations, greener with a smaller footprint, at least from the environmental perspective. And we are trying to achieve, we must try to achieve together what Senator Leahy has been doing here in Vermont, and that is to ensure that we can transition to affordable and renewable sources of energy, that we continuously look to ensure that while meeting our own operational needs for energy in the United Nations, we design systems that strengthen the renewable energy infrastructure of host countries and communities. We must, whether we are engaged in a humanitarian operation or in a peacekeeping operation or in a developmental operation, not only keep our own environmental footprint light, but we must ensure that we leave behind a positive legacy for the people once our own work is done. I think it would be extremely beneficial to the people we serve when our humanitarian, development, peace building, peacekeeping approaches align and complement each other to address both the causes and the consequences of today's humanitarian crisis. I mention both the causes and consequences because sometimes we cannot deal with the causes immediately, like is the case today between Russia and Ukraine. But at least we can deal with the consequences. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, promoted by the Secretary General, my boss, Mr. Antonio Guterres, which has by now ensured 600,000 metric tons of food grains which were stuck in Ukraine to be transported to countries in need, including inter alia by purchases through the World Food Program with a ship called the Brave Commander, which has now left Turkey to go to Djibouti. At the same time, obviously, we also need to ensure free access to the food grains and fertilizers from the Russian Federation for those who need it. But I think we need to reflect continuously on addressing the causes, but also addressing the consequences, at least till such time the causes cannot be fully redressed. I mention this because I do hope that this forum, as it develops, will give us an opportunity to reflect on various aspects of humanitarian crisis we face today, and to be encouraged to work together creatively, innovatively in addressing the current needs and hopefully reducing the potential needs for the future. Thank you very much.
And now it's a pleasure to introduce His Excellency Mr. Carlito Nunes, the Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Permanent Representative of the Permanent Mission of Timor-Leste. Ambassador Nunes presented his credentials to the Secretary General in August 2021, and before this latest appointment, Ambassador Nunes served as the Senior Program Manager for Democracy and Governance at the International Republican Institute beginning in 2007. Among other achievements, he oversaw the Institute's operations in Timor-Leste, coordinated its program and activities development, and liaised with a range of international organizations and donors. Ambassador Nunes previously worked at the Institute from 2002 to 2004, during which time he held the position of Program Officer for Grassroots Political Party Development. He also served as a Senior Program Officer for Security Sector Reform at the Democratic National Institute of Timor-Leste. And he was the interim director during the country's military and political crisis from December 2005 until September 2006. Between 1999 and 2002, Ambassador Nunes was a program officer with the International Organization for Migration, where he helped to organize the repatriation of Timorese refugees from West Timor to Timor-Leste. In 1999, he served with the United Nations mission in East Timor. We are honored for Ambassador Timor-Leste to make the journey and come to Vermont. Thank you so much.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Carson Tambur, founder and executive director, and also Mrs. Ivan, and Excellency Dr. Atul Kari, United Nations Operational Support under UN Secretary General, Excellency Dr. David Baushani, former senior UN official executive secretary for Mr. Sergio Vieira de Mello. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you, Grace Initiative Global and Yale Divinity School for the convening this initiative of the occasion of the World Humanitarian Day. Ladies and gentlemen, on this day in 2003, the Brazilian United Nations diplomat Sergio Vieira de Mello, in his capacity as a special representative of the United Nations Secretary General in Iraq, was killed in a bomb attack on the UN office in Baghdad, along with 20 of his staff and visitors. As a tribute to them, August 19 is now observed as a World Humanitarian Day. Ladies and gentlemen, Timor-Leste has a great honor to have Sergio Vieira de Mello as the head of the United Nations Transition Administration in East Timor, UNTAED, in late 1999 until May 2002. During this period, Timor-Leste's leaders were working very closely and friendly with him and experienced his humanitarian activist and leader. He was indeed highly intelligent, a polyglot, eloquent, charismatic, charming, courageous, enterprising, and 100% committed. Timorese people consider Mr. Sergio Vieira de Mello was one of the most brilliant officials of the United Nations. He left in Timor-Leste an inspiring legacy and his ideas of a democratic rule of law and peace. Timor-Leste's people and its leaders were shocked on 19 August 2003 to hear that tragic death of Mr. Sergio Vieira de Mello, along with his staff, caused by a barbaric bomb attack on the United Nations office in Baghdad. On that day, the world lost a great humanitarian activist and leader. Ladies and gentlemen, to recognize and honor the generous and altruistic dedication of Sergio Vieira de Mello and other humanitarian workers around the world, on January 30, 2008, on a visit to Brasilia, President Ramos Horta announced the creation of a Human Rights Award in Timor-Leste to be named Sergio Vieira de Mello. The Sergio Vieira de Mello Human Rights Award, established by Decree Law 16/2009 on March 19, 2009, is awarded by the President of the Republic and aims to highlight the activity of Timorese and foreign citizens, governmental and non-governmental organizations in the promotion protection, and dissemination of human rights in Timor-Leste. On December 10 every year, the President of the Republic awards the individuals, governmental and non-governmental organizations for their creativity, commitments, dedication, sacrifice, vision, and persistence in promoting, defending, and enacting human rights in Timor-Leste through their action. Ladies and gentlemen, humanitarian needs today are exponentially high. This is due to the effect of prolonged conflict, the climate crisis, and the recent COVID-19. Ironically, attacks of humanitarian workers have been increased in conflict zones across the globe. The humanitarian workers are killed, injured, sexually assaulted, kidnapped, or detained as they work to help the world's most vulnerable people. The international humanitarian law does exist to protect relief operations and humanitarian workers and facilitate aid reaching the people who are in needing it to survive. However, too often highlighted parties, both state and non-state armed groups, refuse to observe it. In this kind of situation, the international community needs urgent action to insist the conflict parties to let the humanitarian workers and suppliers out of this line of fire and ensure relief gets to where it's needed. We are convinced that to protect humanitarian workers in conflict zones, the states and non-state armed groups who are participating in fighting must observe their obligation under international humanitarian law. The allegation of serious violation of this law must be investigated, and perpetrators must be accountable and be punished. War crimes that go unpunished embolden perpetrators to commit further violations of human rights. To conclude, today is the World Humanitarian Day. It is indeed a moment to commemorate humanitarian workers who have lost their life in saving the world's most vulnerable populations. The only way to honor their legacy is to take meaningful and immediate action to protect each and every humanitarian worker who is still working tirelessly in conflict zones across the globe. I thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Dr. David S. Bassioni. He is a veteran humanitarian and emergency expert. He served with the United Nations system for over 20 years, primarily with UNICEF, DHA, OCHA, and UN Development Organization. He was the first ever humanitarian coordinator and the only coordinator to be appointed by the Secretary General and the Security Council. Dr. Bassioni's expertise cuts broadly across humanitarian affairs and assistance in complex emergencies, conflict, crisis resolution, safety, security, change management, and sustainable development. His first career was in veterinarian medicine. He has held several senior positions in the UN, including Deputy Director of UNICEF Office for Emergency Programs, Chief of Interagency and Responses for OCHA, and Coordinator for IASC. He was a rapporteur to the high-level panel on humanitarian response and Senior Technical Coordinator for the Joint UN World Bank Needs Assessment for Somalia. He has served as UNICEF's representative in 7 countries, including Somalia, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Ethiopia, occupied Palestine territory, Egypt, and Bangladesh. Prior to his career in the UN, Dr. Bassioni served in several government positions, including Regional Minister of Agriculture and Natural Resources in Sudan. He is currently on the executive board of the Sergio Vieira de Mello Foundation, and he is serving as the secretary. So without further ado, Dr. Bassioni. And sorry for the delay.
Thank you very much, Vaughn. I must thank you and also the sponsors of this particular Vermont Humanitarian Forum. I think this forum is important for a number of reasons. One is that perhaps it's the first time that outside the UN, a forum of this type has been held. And that's a testament that the World Humanitarian Day is not stagnant, is not stuck with the UN, but is catching, following, and therefore I congratulate you, the Yale Divinity, and the Stratton Mountain School for hosting this particular occasion. I'm delighted to join you. As all of you know, the Sergio Vieira de Mello Foundation was created and established by the family of Sergio Vieira de Mello and friends of Sergio de Mello in Geneva. It started in 2005 and continued on until now. So it's been it's been existing for about 12 years. The foundation was established and dedicated to promote dialogue for the peaceful resolution of conflict, and has been established as an international entity under the Swiss law to continue Sergio's mission and fulfill his vision. Through won an annual prize in his name awarded to individuals, institutions, or communities in recognition of their outstanding and unique work undertaken to achieve peaceful reconciliation between peoples and parties in conflict. Number two, it has been running an annual memorial lecture in the name of Sergio Vieira de Mello in conjunction with the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, HEID. And usually these lectures take place in about mid-March. And a number of international personalities, including people like Mark Malloch Brown and several other dignitaries who have spoken at this forum. It is also supporting initiatives and efforts that promote peaceful reconciliation and coexistence between people and communities divided by conflict. And it advocates for the security and the independence of humanitarian actors, wherever they may be operating and whomever they may be working for. All of this come really to its climax around the World Humanitarian Day, which is of course established following the tragic bomb attack on Canal Hotel in Baghdad on 19th of August 2003, where Sergio Vieira de Mello, then the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General for Iraq, and several other colleagues were killed. The Sergio Vieira de Mello Foundation, as I said, started about 2005. I joined much later, in about 2007. And at the time we were establishing the foundation and thinking through what it would be engaged with. But then we really came to the core issue of how can we mark this day internationally. And so a good part of our work was then around conceptualizing what sort of lasting memory and lasting legacy could Sergio Vieira de Mello leave on the world of humanitarians, the humanitarian sphere as an area in which he not only distinguished himself, but also led as a leader up to the level of Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. And we came to the idea of dedicating a day in the year to be known. We've searched a lot for what such a day should be named. At last we came to the day, we call it the World Humanitarian Day. And I am happy that day we're marking this as it takes a village and focusing on climate change. It is marked yearly all over the world, and I'm happy that this time we're marking it in Vermont. The resolution, one of the things that we should also be happy about is that I was the one who drafted the resolution for the World Humanitarian Day as the Secretary of the Foundation. And if you saw my final draft, that was then taken and sold to the General Assembly. It is a far cry from what the resolution is now. Resolution is about 6 pages. But in 2009, on the 5th of March 2009, the General Assembly adopted resolution A/res/63/139 on 5th of March 2009 on strengthening of the coordination of emergency assistance in the United Nations. And that resolution very clearly said that first, it decides to designate 19th of August as World Humanitarian Day in order to contribute to increasing public awareness about humanitarian assistance activities worldwide, and the importance and profound importance of international cooperation in this regard, as well as to honor all humanitarian and United Nations associated personnel who have worked in the promotion of the humanitarian cause, and those who have lost their lives in the cause of duty, and invites all member states and the entities of the United Nations within existing resources, as well as other international organizations and non-governmental organizations, to observe this particular day annually in an appropriate manner. That runs this particular resolution. In hindsight, it was, I think, a foresight that we thought of a resolution. Because one of the realities in the humanitarian assistance and humanitarian field is the fact that resolutions, conventions, norms are not lacking. What is lacking is enforcing them. And that is why today we have such a problem. For example, Ukraine, where a humanitarian crisis has been politicized by the conflict, almost the conflict between the superpowers. And we see more and more of this. We see it in Yemen, we see it in Syria, we see it in DRC and many other countries. Now, this resolution is important because it binds all the member states of the United Nations to mark this particular day, a reminder to everybody that we have a duty to people who are in conflict. We have a duty across the board, regardless of what side we are on, to reach people and reach them with assistance and also with support to come out of this crisis into recovery, into reconstruction, into development, and possibly into normalcy and prosperity. So that is why we say this is one of the greatest achievements for us in the foundation. One of the things that we are so proud of is that Sergio Vieira de Mello was a world citizen. He was born as Brazilian and died a Brazilian, but he served as a servant to all, as a citizen of the world. And the fact that I, from South Sudan, the youngest of all countries in the world, to come and address you here just emphasizes the universality and also the diversity that we have in the board, and also with all of you as supporters of people who are affected by humanitarian crisis. I hope this is the beginning of many, many things to come. And again, I congratulate the Vermont Humanitarian Forum for this initiative. So I will stop here, and if there are questions, I'm quite ready to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Abraham Joseph has a question.
Yes.
Hello, David. I hope you're
Yes, hello.
Yeah, I just want to ask a question.
Let me see you.
Yeah, in fact, I'd like to ask a question as you are from South Sudan. What is the situation now in South Sudan and the humanitarian situation there? If you can explain that, please.
The situation in South Sudan is, as you know, Serbia served in East Timor, one of the last two countries of the century to become independent. South Sudan became independent after East Timor. And we are fortunate to have had that opportunity because the world was not expecting any new country. So when I, in the delegation of South Sudan, went to the Security Council to present the case of the admission of South Sudan into the UN, it passed the Security Council very easily. It went to the General Assembly. There was a problem. The problem was of space, because the General Assembly has been designed to fit exactly the number of current members. There had been no expectation that new members would come along and would have to find a space for them. So, to accommodate Sudan, there were two choices. Either to give the place of the Holy See, the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization status to South Sudan, or the Holy See. Now, these were very hard choices. If you gave the place of PLO to South Sudan, that is almost like a mockery. These are people who have been fighting for years for their independence. And South Sudan comes the other day and sadly takes their place. That would be wrong. If you wanted to take the place of the Holy See, that would also be wrong, because you are taking the place of God. So in the end, one country saved the situation, Mauritius. Mauritius offered its place to South Sudan and went to the gallery. And we are most grateful for that, because that way South Sudan was seated and accepted as a member of the Community of Nations. Now, having been treated and favored in such a way, and we always say that the independence of South Sudan was like the delivery of the children of Israel from Egypt. South Sudan squandered all the goodwill of the world and went into a long civil war. Poor governance, corruption, and all sorts of things, and today it continues to be almost what we call a failed state. So as we speak now, there is an agreement which, if implemented, could get South Sudan out of the conflict. But the agreement, the government of the day has failed to implement the agreement, and it is asking time and again extending its term in office. It has now extended its term again by 24 months in order to implement, but we are not sure that, so there is an uprising almost of everybody, including myself, that we will not give this government another chance to renew its mandate in office. And therefore, time has come now where everybody, South Sudanese, are organizing themselves into what they call a new dispensation for South Sudan, in which they want a national consensus declaration, a grand coalition of all political forces, a roundtable conference where they will discuss the future of South Sudan, a new roadmap for South Sudan, a new interim period in which they want a government, new government of either technocrats and hybrid. And so this is the situation, the uncertain situation in which South Sudan is today. Crisis is not yet solved, and there is a lot of agitation and tension. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bruciani. So Ms. Ruben Manik-Davila, career with the United Nations High Commission Refugees spans over 27 years and includes a range of functions both at UNHCR headquarters as well as its country's operations in Thailand, Turkmenistan, and the United States. She obtained her LLB and her LLM in the European Community and Public International Law from the University of Paris, too. She is fluent in English and French, and she is currently the director of the UNHCR Office of the United Nations in New York. And she reports to UNHCR Executive Secretary, Executive Director directly. Our second speaker is Douglas Mercado, and he is the head of he was the head of the Office of World Food Program in Romania. He's also just recently returned from Moldova. He served in other posts that I know in Colombia, and I don't know how many other countries, but he can let us know. He is a guest lecturer at Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Mr. Diego Azario, who is with us virtually. He is with the Canadian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he is a senior advisor for a new position at NATO dealing with climate security. And we have Dr. Richard Malika, who I know, so I don't have to look at his bio so much, but he was the founder of the Harvard Refugee Trauma Program, which was the first refugee trauma program in the United States. He did his MAR, Master's of Religion at Yale, and he did his clinical practice at Harvard. He was a professor, full professor at Harvard School of Medicine, along with his wonderful wife, who's sitting there, as a psychologist. And so Richard has devoted his life to dealing with refugee trauma, and he is going to speak today about the need and the lack of empathy. And we also have with us today the CEO of Vermont Food Bank. And the Vermont Food Bank deals with the humanitarian crisis of a state, and that is food hunger. And there is a large proportion of people in Vermont that are at the level of poverty and of hunger and do depend on the food bank, and he will explain that. And our moderator, I'm really sorry for all this. Ashish Pradhan, who is the International Crisis Group's senior UN analyst. He joined the Crisis Group's UN team in New York in 2015, and alongside the Chief of Policy, represents the organization at the United Nations. He is responsible for engagement with the UN Secretariat, Security Council members, and other member states, as his work primarily focuses on African and Asian crisis. She regularly relays crisis groups, field-based analysts to UN officials and member state diplomats, especially in the lead-up to key Security Council discussions and resolutions. Previously, he worked for 3 years in the International Crisis Group Asia program, conducting research and constitution writing process in Nepal. He attended the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and Georgetown University for his bachelor's. So he will be your moderator. So first we'll begin with Reuven.
Is it okay if I speak from here, or do I?
Whatever you would prefer.
All right. Since we are really speaking to the audience here, I hope you don't mind if I just sit here and communicate directly. Just to say, before I start, first, Ms. Ludowski, Mr. Thurber, thank you so much for inviting me here for this, and really for inaugurating this amazing initiative, the Vermont Humanitarian Forum. Before I was actually asked to speak on the global conflict on refugees and on resettlement trends for refugees. But before I do that, I really would like to join the previous speakers, Ambassador Nunes, USG Hare, and others, in really reminding us why we're here today, which is really that today is World Humanitarian Day. It's a day when the United Nations and its partners take the time to commemorate, to remember the staff who gave their lives on the humanitarian front lines. And this is not just, as Mr. Basuni himself was saying, this is really not just an empty day, if you like. Just last year, we had some 460 humanitarian staff who were attacked. 141 were killed. This is all in the space of 12 months. 203 were wounded, and 117 were kidnapped. And 98% of these people were actually nationals operating in their own countries, and 53% of them were staff working with local NGOs. So I would really like to take this time to pay my own homage to my colleagues who are operating on the humanitarian front lines, from Kiev to Kabul, from Baghdad to Kinshasa, and who literally are risking their lives on a daily basis. So that was really that. Just to set the stage in terms of the global conflict of refugees, just a stark reminder of some of the statistics. We passed a really unfortunate milestone of 100 million forcibly displaced people in the world today, last May, so that was really just a couple of months ago. And that's comparable to 1 in every 78 people on this planet. That's the equivalent of the 10th most populated country on the planet. So that's just to give you an idea of the breadth and dimensions of the displacement problem. 26 million of those 100 million forcibly displaced are actually refugees. In other words, they've actually left their countries of origin and gone to another country to seek asylum. So out of these refugees, 2/3 of this refugee population are really from a handful of countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, and of course now the Ukraine. And the vast majority of these refugees are actually hosted again by a handful of countries, most of which are developing economies: Colombia, Pakistan, Uganda, Turkey, and the only developed economy amongst the top 5 is Germany to host these refugees. So this is really a stark reminder that the humanitarian problem is actually remaining very much in the developing nations, that it is really, despite some of the narrative, the media that you see in the Western world, that this is not really a Western problem, that it's really been confined very much to the developing nations and to those developing continents, and that some of the xenophobic messages that are so prevalent in the world, certainly in the Western media, are really extremely misleading, given the fact that the vast majority of these refugees are actually in neighboring countries to their own countries of origin in the developed world, in the developing world. Why was a global compact on refugees necessary? Because we already have 2 international conventions, 2 binding treaties relating to refugees, which were concluded in the aftermath of the Second World War. So this is really in response to the displacement that was generated by the fighting in the Second World War, where the international community got together and decided that they needed an international treaty to regulate the status of these people. And it was really thought at that time that in about 5 years, the whole refugee problem would have blown over, and UNHCR, which was created, again, through these conventions, would basically be out of a job. Well, 70 years down the road, we realize that we are still very much, unfortunately, extremely heavily employed, that it doesn't look like there is going to be any decrease in the humanitarian crises around the world today. On the contrary, they are increasing exponentially, as we can see. And it was decided that in 2018, the General Assembly decided that the 1951 Convention responded to a time when the world was a lot more black and white, where refugees basically fled for a temporary, short period of time, then there was a solution that was identified for their problems, and they were no longer refugees. 70 years down the road, we realized it's actually not true. Most refugees stay refugees pretty much for decades. I was serving as the head of the UNHCR operation in Pakistan before coming to New York. And Pakistan is currently hosting 1.4 million Afghan refugees, and most of these refugees have been there for 40 years now. That means there are almost 3 to 4 generations of Afghans who were born and brought up in Pakistan who have never actually seen their country, but who have retained their status as refugees because they have not been granted the possibility of integrating locally in Pakistan. So it was decided that it was really to address situations like this that the Global Compact on Refugees was necessary. So what the Compact actually does is recognize 4 key objectives. One is to recognize the fact that, as I was saying previously, most refugees are hosted in developing countries, not in the Western economies. And that contribution by these developing countries needs to be recognized. And that they also require assistance to host these refugees for such protracted periods of time. The second was that refugees, because of the fact that refugee situations have now become more and more protracted, when in 1951, when the treaty was concluded, a normal lifespan of a refugee situation would be 1 to 5 years maximum. Now the average lifespan of a refugee situation will be anything between 10 to 15 to 20 or 40 years, as we have seen in certain situations. So it was agreed then that the Compact should also look at enhancing the self-reliance of refugees who are in these protracted situations. And then the third objective was really to work more proactively in identifying solutions for these refugees. One being third country solutions. I think we just heard a reference to the fact that Vermont has accepted Afghan refugees on resettlement here. So that is very much one of the solutions that we're looking at. The second one, which is actually possibly the primary solution, is really for the refugees to be able to go back voluntarily to their own countries. That is possibly the most practical and the most feasible solution, given the fact that you have over 26 million refugees today in the world today, and that it's extremely unlikely that resettlement countries are going to accept that number of people. So these are the 4 key objectives of the Global Compact on Refugees. And the Compact also recognizes the fact that it's not just member states that are responsible for assisting, protecting and assisting refugees. It's all different sectors of society. So whether it's a private sector, whether it's academia, whether it's civil society, that these are all called on to contribute to assisting and protecting refugees around the world. So that, in a nutshell, is what the Global Compact on Refugees is. What it is not is that it is not a binding treaty. It's exactly what it says it is. It's simply a compact, which different sectors of society and the member states have agreed should really be something that brings people together in order to look at the refugee situations in a new and innovative way. And we hope that that is indeed what the Compact will achieve eventually. Looking at resettlement trends, as I said, the Compact on Refugees does look at this as being one of the issues that, one of the key objectives of the Compact. And unfortunately, we were just looking at the statistics. For next year, we think that there will be almost 2 million refugees who are going to be in need of resettlement. So these are people, refugees who are currently living in asylum countries who, for various reasons, cannot remain in those countries but require a third country solution. Very much like the Afghans living in Pakistan, a certain number of them would obviously be required resettlement elsewhere. Because of the fact, for example, of these 2 million, what we have realized is that at least 37% of these 2 million require resettlement for physical or legal protection reasons, because they cannot, for legal or physical protection reasons, remain in their countries of asylum. That 32% require resettlement because they are survivors of violence or torture, and that some 17% are women and children who are at high risk in their countries of asylum. In other words, it's women who are single women, heads of households, unaccompanied children with no visible families, either in countries of origin or in the countries of asylum. So these are essentially the categories that we are prioritizing in terms of resettlement. Resettlement as a solution really applies to less than 1% of the global refugee population. And unfortunately, while the resettlement needs are great, 2 million for next year, the resettlement cases that are available are woefully inadequate. We are lucky if we get even 100,000 resettlement slots every year from member states offering that as an opportunity for refugees. So you can see there's a lot of work that needs to be done to reconcile those different needs versus the actual places that are available in the different countries. So I think I'll just stop there because I know there are several speakers here. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ruben. I can take over. I think we now have Diego's due to speak.
Yeah.
Check, I can check these. Diego, if you can hear us, I think we can now hear from you about the intersection of climate and security.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure and an honor to be part of this event, and I'm very, very sorry I couldn't make it today. It's a lot of logistical issues in big time, especially you cannot really use every part of it. I just wanted to make certain points in terms of what's happening with the climate change and the security situation. Because clearly today we're not disputing the fact that we have a problem with climate change. But there are many layers. And I do have to say that what I'm saying here is I'm saying on my personal capacity and not on behalf of the Canadian government. One of the things that relate to climate security is that it relates to the level of resilience and the capacity of different societies to face the brunt of a very difficult and a very diffuse threat. When we deal with disasters of different types, and I was a humanitarian officer, well, we basically had situation response. When we deal with issues related to conflict, anything linked to armed confrontations of different types, we know that by addressing some of the issues related to conflict, we might have to give a resolution. That will lead to a situation where we can enter with humanitarian aid, and then we can have some sort of from the initial disruption. But in the case of climate change, we're entering into a new era for which probably we might not have the right approach in terms of how to define the problem and how to define the solution. So what I mean by this is that climate change is a diffuse and a very cognitively challenging situation, and in fact, we don't know where climate change is. It's everywhere. And it's increasing at a rate that is not perceptible to generate the kind of reaction that will help us get onto high gear and have the type of response that we do. That is one element. The second is that we're talking about climate change, and that includes many things. Climate change and the energy revolution. Climate change and the emissions. Climate change and what we would like to do in terms of changing the economy, rearranging the financial sector, and figuring out what kind of solutions are going to help us deal with this major challenge for humanity. And all those are very important. And the Paris Agreement, and COP27, and COP28, and 29, and many others to come, they're all extremely important. But there is one thing that is very much of a concern for all of us, and is if you allow me to use the word, climate change and the subset of climate change and security. Because even if we were able to solve all these other problems I mentioned before, we will still have to deal with the fact that climate change has already a major impact on the capacity of many societies to deal with the conflict and the conflict-linked situations that could be somehow related to climate change. I'm not going here for the threshold of proof that is necessary for an academic paper. I'm saying, as a policymaker, as a practitioner, we know something is happening here. We know we're dealing with the consequences of that situation, and we don't know exactly how to respond, how to mitigate, how to facilitate a solution, how to even eliminate that cause of things. In terms of climate change and security, we're clearly dealing with a new way of defining sources of instability. Because it's going to be impervious, permanent, diffused, and how you tackle it. You can say, well, we're going to deal with conflicts and we're going to increase our capacity to deal with disasters. Great, but that's just addressing the symptoms. How can we tackle that? How can we facilitate the possibility for communities to increase their own resilience, their own capacity to address conflicts that are linked to situations of climate change? And how can, I was a former OCHA officer and a humanitarian political officer of the UN, how can we rearrange the different sections of the UN system, the humanitarian system, the international community, so that we are ready to understand the nature of the problem that is coming to us? We already seen some of the beginnings of, and I wouldn't say just the beginnings, we're seeing some major substantial impacts of climate change and their relation to security. Now, people will say, oh, well, we haven't been able to prove that the Syria conflict was linked to climate change or that the situation in Mali is linked to it. Perhaps, but it's not because we cannot make those correlations scientifically that those correlations are not there. And being able to prove it is certainly one important thing, but being able to address the fact that we have to deal with this situation is perhaps a little bit more of a high priority. And it's clear, as a practitioner, as a person that deals with this from the angle of, okay, we have a problem, how are we going to address it? We are very much in a situation in which we find ourselves in lack of proper tools to define the problem, to quantify, to address it, and to figure out solutions. Because it might surprise you if I say this, maybe not, but I don't think the international system, the humanitarian, the political, and the institutional frameworks that we have are ready to deal with the kind of exponential and multiplication of conflicts that will be linked somehow to the climate change situation. That is certainly a problem, and for me is an opportunity to make a call for all of us to really try to tackle this, to try to understand the fact that we have something new. Our tools are not made for this, and we cannot handle it as it is today. And I will just finish with this. When we talk about negotiation, mediation, conflict management, different things, we have done a lot of things at the international level. There are networks, there are communities of practice. The field has certainly made a lot of progress, and we do have a lot of capacities to deal with different types of conflicts. But in all those types of conflicts, there is one assumption, that is that there is a rationale, or that there is at least an interlocutor on the other side. And the one thing that is so startling about it is that with climate change, we have the effects of a major reduction in the quality of the ecosystems, the life-sustaining systems that support all of us. But we don't have an interlocutor. We don't have an actor that we could negotiate, argue, or facilitate something. So I just will finish by saying this. Climate change and security is extremely important. It's a dimension that is becoming a bit of a buzzword. And a lot of people say climate change and security from different angles. Climate change and security conflict, climate change and security radicalization. But what is it? How are we dealing with this? How can we define it? And how can we realign the different factors that we have and the different resources that we have in the international community to tackle this global risk, an extremely problematic situation that might make previous crises fail on purpose. I used to say in many presentations I gave during the pandemic that COVID-19 was some sort of a preview to a horror movie that is called climate change. And I would say climate change and security is the real target. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Diego, for your comments as well. And if you could stay online for the Q&A part, we might come back to you. So next we've got Douglas to speak to us from your perspective, having just been deployed in Moldova, and from the perspective also from your WFP role in the past.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to Yvonne for inviting me to join the Vermont Humanitarian Forum today for its first ever event here. Maybe just as a bit of a prelude, I've been doing humanitarian work for about 32 years, going back to Sudan in 1992, where you had a refugee crisis, refugees pouring over the border from neighboring Ethiopia. It's been a real privilege to work in this field. You really get a chance, I think, to see some of the challenges countries around the world face, and you have the opportunity to hopefully make things somewhat better for the people facing these crises. So I want to talk specifically about Ukraine and my participation most recently in the humanitarian response to the Ukraine crisis. Back in February when the war started, it was exactly February the 24th, I was at home in Richmond, Virginia, and talking with a lot of my neighbors who were very concerned. It seemed like it really generated, at least in my community, but I think throughout the United States and perhaps other parts of the world, it generated a lot of genuine concern. Individuals who maybe didn't think about international issues that much saw the media coverage of the beginning of the war, and they felt like they wanted to do something to help, which was great. I mean, I fully applaud the empathy and the willingness to try and help out others in their time of need, but I was also somewhat troubled, I would say, because having done this for 32 years, I realized that Ukraine is not the only humanitarian crisis that we're looking at in the world. And why weren't my neighbors and other fellow Americans as interested in the conflict in Yemen or the conflict in Syria or what's happening in Venezuela? So sometimes I think we're distracted by what we just see in the media, and we forget to take a look at the bigger picture. There's many crises happening right now, humanitarian crises. Some are triggered by conflicts, some are triggered by natural disasters, some by the pandemic we recently went through, some are related to political and economic instability. But there certainly is no lack of a need for humanitarian assistance around the world. And I just was trying to explain to my neighbors, I was very happy that they were concerned about Ukraine, but please also be concerned about South Sudan, about Mozambique, about Bangladesh, for example, Myanmar, Syria. There's many other countries we need to think about, and let's not just focus and devote all of our resources to one particular crisis, because the needs really are spread out around the world. So that was sort of, one concern. And then the second concern was sort of the way that they wanted to help. Initially, there were lots of signs of solidarity in my neighborhood. People were hanging Ukrainian flags from their windows, putting ribbons around telephone poles, and that was great, expressions of solidarity. But then some of my neighbors wanted to move beyond that and provide some assistance. So one fellow down the street decided to buy himself an air ticket, and he flew to Poland to go to the Polish border where refugees were streaming across from Ukraine, and he wanted to hand out food there. That was one example. Another neighbor decided she was going to go online and petition everybody else in my community to donate medical supplies for the Ukraine crisis. Okay, that was another effort to help out. And the third was a phone call I received from a friend who lives in California, in Silicon Valley, and her tech firm wanted to provide some information management solutions for the refugee crisis affecting the countries neighboring Ukraine. Again, I think, this was a great show of empathy, but I would say these people weren't doing the right thing. For example, the neighbor who flew to Poland to hand out food, I mean, there was really no need. There's plenty of people in Poland who were there at the border who could hand out the food. He didn't have to spend $3,000 or $4,000 to fly across the ocean. He had no particular skills, that put him in a better position than the average Pole who was volunteering to hand out food. And the money this individual spent on the airfare, the hotel, and so forth could have been provided to a local NGO that was leading the effort to distribute the food. So I just told my neighbor, think about that next time. What's the best way you can help out? It's great that you're concerned, but maybe there's a more efficient way for you to use your resources to help a greater number of people rather than, I understood the need, he wanted to go there and be there personally, but it wasn't, I think, the best way to assist people. The neighbor who was collecting medical supplies, again, I mean, this person had never been to Ukraine, had never been to the neighboring countries, didn't really know what the needs were. What exactly were the medical needs? They hadn't done a proper assessment. They were just making assumptions. Oh, they'll need bandages and certain medications and so forth. But again, that wasn't the right approach, because if you're going to provide humanitarian assistance in a proper way, you need to do a thorough needs assessment to really understand what are the kinds of assistance, whether they're medical goods, food, whatever, that you should be providing. You don't just collect whatever you have in your cabinet and send it over, because it may not be useful. And in fact, some medications may be illegal for use in other countries. You just can't assume that the medications you can buy off your shelf here would be legally used in other countries. So again, that person probably should have maybe tried to collect funding, maybe from the community, and then found a reputable NGO that specializes in healthcare in one of the neighboring countries like Poland or Moldova, Romania, that could have procured medical supplies locally and provided to the people in need there. And the third example, the Silicon Valley tech firm, they wanted to go and set up this information management system, but you know, there's amazingly talented people in all of these countries that were receiving the refugees, whether it was Moldova, Romania, Poland, and the people there from the tech sector were already putting together the solutions on the ground. So you didn't need somebody from far away to come and provide that service, because the local talent was already there. Maybe they needed some financial support to help them put together the information management solutions. But so, you know, this is, I guess, a point I'm always trying to make is, it's great that we all want to help out when we see a humanitarian crisis, but we have to stop and think, what's the best way I can help out? You know, what can I do as an individual that's really going to be most effective and really meet the needs on the ground there? So that's I guess, the first point I'd like to make from the U.S. perspective before I even left to go to the region. So then I was deployed by the World Food Program, first to go to Romania as the head of office for their logistics operation, providing food into Ukraine. And then later I was sent to Moldova, the neighboring country, where I was the emergency coordinator providing assistance to refugees and host communities. So just a few lessons learned from my experience, particularly in Moldova. And this is something we don't see everywhere, so I think is to be commended. I think the response from the Moldovan government and the people of Moldova was really exemplary, and they really stood up at the time of need, because initially when the war began, over 500,000 Ukrainian refugees fled into Moldova. And that's a big number when you look at 500,000, but when you consider that Moldova is a country of 2.5 million people, that's a significant burden and challenge for both the government and the people of Moldova. And it's one of the poorest countries in Europe as well, so a particular challenge for this country of Moldova. But they really rose up. I think, you know, they could have turned their backs on the refugees. They could have said, we can't do anything, we're a poor country. But they really did quite a bit. The government, even though it had meager resources, dipped into its state food reserves, for example, which are meant for the people of Moldova normally in the times of need. But the government dipped into its state food reserves and was providing food assistance to the refugees during the initial weeks of the crisis, which was highly commendable, I think. And then the people of Moldova, too, I think opened up their homes to the refugees, because the people that came in needed somewhere to stay, and there simply weren't enough shelters for 500,000 people who were coming across. So many Ukrainian refugees found a welcome in Moldovan households who allowed them to come and stay in their spaces. And you don't see that in every country either. So I think just the warm welcome both from the government of Moldova and the people of Moldova was really exemplary, and I think that should be encouraged. So WP, the organization I worked for there, we were trying to assist the refugees. We were providing hot meals to those refugees who are living in what are known as refugee accommodation centers, because they didn't have the means to prepare the food themselves, so we were providing 3 meals a day. But for those Moldovan families that were hosting the refugees, that represented a significant financial burden, because when you have an extra maybe 5 or 10 people staying at your house, your utility bills are going to go up. You're paying more for water, you're paying more for electricity, gas, you're probably sharing your food, and so it comes at a cost. And again, many Moldovans live on modest incomes that are in fact sometimes live in poverty. So WFP and other organizations began providing assistance to the host community, to the people that were housing the refugees in their homes, to help them offset some of the additional expenses they were incurring by allowing the refugees to come and find shelter in their homes. And this is, I think, a very important point, because while we always need to think about assisting the refugees, providing the basics for refugees who are fleeing war and violence, we also have to think about assisting the host communities who are receiving them, because oftentimes these host communities don't have much in terms of resources themselves, and if we only provide assistance to the refugees and we neglect the host communities, then that might become unsustainable over the long term. And we want to encourage those communities to continue welcoming the refugees, continue hosting them, and providing that shelter. So then the third lesson, I would say, coming out of my Moldova experience was just the importance for capacity strengthening. Again, the government of Moldova was very welcoming. It took, I think, a correct approach in opening its borders and allowing the refugees to come freely into the country. But I think they clearly lacked the capacity to manage this themselves, this crisis, by themselves. And that's why they invited the international community to come in and support their efforts to receive and assist the refugees. So before the conflict, you really didn't have any humanitarian agencies present in Moldova. There wasn't a need for a humanitarian presence. But the conflict in Ukraine changed all of that. So all of a sudden, groups like the World Food Program, other UN agencies, if they were there already, they had to scale up and build up their emergency capacities, or they had to come and open up an office and bring in staff and start their activities to assist the refugees. So I think just the fact that the government of Moldova welcomed and encouraged international participation is promising. Because again, that's not what we see in every country where there's a crisis. Sometimes countries aren't so willing to allow international agencies to come into the country and start providing assistance. So again, Moldova, I think, was a good example of how countries should react when they see a crisis, when they realize they don't have the capacity themselves. They should welcome international efforts. And that's why the United Nations and other international agencies exist, to bring relief to countries in times of need and crisis, like the one we're seeing now linked to the Ukraine war. So yeah, I think those are sort of some of my final comments. Maybe one more thing too. The government did invite us in. We're providing assistance to the refugees in support of the government efforts. But I think it's also important while we're there as international agencies to strengthen the capacities of the national government. So I know that WFP and UNHCR and other agencies, while we're there assisting the refugees in the host communities, we're also developing programs to strengthen the government so it has better capacity in the future to deal with shocks and crises like the refugee influx that came from Ukraine. I just left just about 3 or 4 days ago, so this is all still very fresh in my mind. Unfortunately, I think the war in Ukraine is going to go on for some time. I don't see a peace process leading to an end of the fighting anytime soon, so we'll need continued humanitarian assistance in Ukraine. I think we collectively, as the international community, but as citizens, as fellow Americans, I think we can provide assistance going forward. But again, don't forget the other crises that are happening around the world in countries like Syria, Yemen, and I was just talking with a friend of mine who works for the UN in Jordan, and the UN is having to cut the food rations right now to Syrian refugees in Jordan because there's not enough funding, simply not enough funding. So there's a lot of need out there in the world. I encourage participation, certainly at the local level. I'm glad to see that Vermont is tracking the issue of humanitarian assistance very closely, but you can be sure that other agencies, international NGOs, and the UN will also be involved in continuing efforts to provide assistance both to the people affected by conflict in Ukraine and other conflicts and crises around the world. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. I think we're lucky to get the really fresh perspectives that you
May I ask a closed question?
Please.
Does Russia provide any humanitarian aid to anywhere?
Yes, they do. I don't have all the facts, but Russia is a donor to some UN agencies in providing humanitarian assistance, and they have their own humanitarian organization called EMERCOM, which in some countries is providing humanitarian assistance. So I know basically that they do. I don't have all the details on where exactly and how much, but they do have humanitarian capacity themselves, and they do provide contributions to the United Nations system for humanitarian assistance. Yeah.
Thanks. So now we'll go to John to speak about the strategy that Vermont has taken in terms of addressing food security and its relevance in terms of humanitarian response.
Thank you. Thank you, Vaughn, for the invitation, and Carson for this great facility and hosting. I have learned so much in the last few hours. I've been working at the Vermont Food Bank for 13 years, and I've lived in Vermont for over 20 years now. And we do kind of live in a bubble here sometimes. I keep up on what's happening in the world, but getting the kinds of detail, just having conversations before this began and hearing the speakers here, it makes me think about how immensely privileged we are here in Vermont. And at the same time, we have challenges. We talked about how Vermont is a place that that provides humanitarian assistance. We have some brand new Afghan families who are living here in Vermont. In the Burlington area, we have other new American families, Nepali, Somali, and some other places in Africa. And yet, we just had some data from University of Vermont. Researchers have been following food insecurity in Vermont since the beginning of the pandemic, since March 2020. And as of a survey they did of a cohort in June and July of this year, 30% of the people in Vermont are experiencing food insecurity. In a state of 640,000 people, that's over 200,000 people. The kind of humanitarian crisis or challenges we have, certainly differ from what they are in other parts of the world. We don't have people near starvation. We don't have people being internally displaced. But as we all know, the experience of the people here in Vermont who are food insecure is an experience that we need to have compassion for also. So the Vermont Food Bank, we are the only food bank in Vermont. We serve the whole state. So we're the World Food Program for Vermont. We provide food to the local food shelves, community-based organizations, the soup kitchens and meal centers, the senior centers, out-of-school programs, any organization basically that serves people with low incomes and deals with food can be a partner of the Vermont Food Bank. This year, we'll distribute about 14 million pounds of food across the state. So we're, a medium-sized food distribution business. But as I said, it feels like a real privilege to live in Vermont, but also to get to do this work in Vermont and support our own people who are struggling. Even with the food insecurity rates in Vermont and across the country, frankly, the biggest and most efficient and effective food security program in this country, in the United States, is the SNAP program, which used to be known as food stamps, and in Vermont we call it 3 Squares Vermont. And what we know is for every meal that a food bank, I'm also part of Feeding America, which is a national network of food banks, over 200 food banks in every county in the country. For every meal that a food bank provides to a person in need across the country, the SNAP program provides 9 meals. So we are really the safety net to the safety net in the food banking world. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is probably, I would say, in the late 70s, 1970s, food banking was very small. And there were certainly people falling off the safety net, but the safety net held people more. Since the 80s, we've really seen food insecurity kind of continually increasing in this country, and food banking growing as a response to that. And I won't call it a solution to that, because I don't think that food banking is a solution to hunger in this country. We have, more episodic, what you might be considered a humanitarian crisis in places like Vermont. So we had, in 2011, we had Tropical Storm Irene, which came through and caused some significant physical damage. Whole towns were cut off. In this part of the state in particular, there were towns, half the town washed away. There were places where the local church just washed away down the road. And the federal government, in that case, FEMA, comes in, provides a lot of assistance, but they also look to the food bank as a logistics expert with warehouses with food in them, with people who know how to deliver that, with community partners on the ground, and so we were able to respond to that. COVID was a really interesting example too. We saw across this country businesses shut down, people isolating, and we saw a immediate need. We foresaw an immediate need. At the food bank, we went to the state of Vermont. We said, this is going to be a mass feeding event. And they just kind of looked at us blankly. Like, what do you mean? And within a week, we had, they snapped out of it. We worked together. We had FEMA providing food. We had the National Guard. We had, in Vermont, literally 1,000 cars lining up at a state airport to get food boxes. People were scared, and people were out of work, and they didn't know when they'd be back to work. They were scared to go to the grocery store. It was a humanitarian crisis in Vermont. And we were able to pull together and respond because there were a lot of resources. But I don't think we responded as well as we could. And one of the things I love about hearing what we're talking about here today is how we can learn from what we've been through, and how we can, at the scale and scope and level of need here in Vermont, how we can continue to do better. We're doing that at the Vermont Food Bank and food banks across the country, really trying to make sure that we're in communication, in a back and forth, a two-way communication with the people we're serving, so that we know the types of food, the way the food is being provided, the times and places are things that are meeting the needs of the people that we're serving. It's not something we've been good at in the past. And I think that that we can do a lot better. And I think that we can learn from what's happening internationally, from international humanitarian efforts, more than we think we can. So this is a great opportunity for me, not only to let you know what we're doing in Vermont, but also to learn. I'm really looking forward to this event growing and getting, I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, I should have 20 of my colleagues doing all different kinds of humanitarian work in the state, in this room, and I'm going to make sure that they're here next year. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John. And last but not least, we will go to Richard to talk about
thank you.
the necessity for empathy.
Yeah, well, I'm going to get into empathy, but first of all, I want to thank Yvonne, who's a great friend and colleague who does such tremendous work in this field, and also I'm honored as a medical doctor to be here with these distinguished policy makers and planners, And so I'm going to segue a little bit into mental health and medicine, if that's okay. Yeah, because we haven't talked much about that yet. And first of all, I want to begin by saying two things. I want to acknowledge the humanitarian workers I've worked with in many countries, including our own clinic, that was one of the first refugee clinics in the United States in 1981. Our clinic has treated over 10,000 survivors of torture, mass violence, rape, etc. in Boston from all over the world since '81. And I want to say that the humanitarian worker is a treasure, must be treasured, and must be cared for. And I'm going to get into this in a minute. They must be cared for because they're not at the level that I would like to see. Okay. The second thing is I've promised my staff that I would always bring up plants and animals because we have to greenify the humanitarian crisis work. It has to go green. And we have a whole paper written about this, and we discussed this a lot. But plants, animals, birds, insects, have brain structures that are linked to our brain structures. Birds have empathy. You know that, right? Mushrooms have 53 words of communicating with each other. Trees give food to other trees when they're suffering. And we can't no longer be in a world where we're not part of the natural world. we got to bring this together in our work in the humanitarian field, right? And we don't have time to talk about the mirror neurons, but the mirror neurons, which are a great discovery by the Italians, are in our cells and in our plants and animals. And also, you probably all know the great letters by Freud and Einstein for the League of Nations, where they talked about why war. We haven't advanced since that discussion. You should look it up, the Einstein-Freud debate about why war. We haven't advanced. And so I want to give you like a 2-minute snapshot of mental health. In 1981, mental health was not on the international policy agenda. We all know that. Mental health was the rubber band effect. You stretch the refugee, they go home, they snap back. They're in a crisis, they go home, they snap back. I want to bring up Mrs. Ogata because Mrs. Ogata, who was a great friend and colleague, who I loved, she loved us, she started the first mental health focal point in the UN High Commissioner's office. You know that, right? It was a revolution because until then, mental health was not even on the international policy agenda for US aid, for the State Department, for the UN, etc. And I think we got to give Mrs. Ogata an award someday for being the pioneer of mental health at the UN. And she did an amazing thing. Okay. So just briefly, if you look at the 3 issues I want to mention, the first issue is that all humanitarian crises are associated with a huge impact on health and mental health. This cannot be denied. And in fact, on the mental health side, we have many, many studies that show, going back to our original research, was anyone here working in Site 2 in the original Thai-Cambodian border camps? That's why I was raised in Site 2. That shows you my age. I go back to the early 1990s. And I spent years working in Site 2 with the Cambodian refugees. We did the first studies there showing the prevalence of mental health. Depression was 60%. The prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder was 30%. And it was associated with high rates of disability. Okay. And we know that you can't just say 60, 30%. That doesn't mean anything. But the research shows that about 10% of children and 5% of adults have serious mental health issues that are threatening their lives in these humanitarian crises. That, because the distribution curve, you might have 60% depression, but it doesn't mean everyone wants to commit suicide or can't function or whatever, We do not have yet parity. We don't have parity between medical care and mental health care for people living through catastrophes, whether they're natural or they're man-made. Plus, human rights violations like I see every day in the Ukraine. I'll see bodies lying in the street in Bucha. I see a woman who's been chopped to pieces after being raped. That family, that community, I know, I've been there, is going to be disturbed for 40, 50, 60, 100 years. How are we going to fix this all over the world where we're doing all these terrible things? I talked to the High Commissioner of Refugees in Lebanon. She came to me and she said, women don't want to tell they've been sexually abused. I said, well, there's 35 medical problems. My wife's here. She's a head of women's health. She knows that. She taught me this. I said, women who've been sexually abused have 35 medical problems. She goes, really? Yeah, I said, women who have been sexually abused have 35 potential medical problems. I said, why don't we put that into the portfolio for an evaluation of refugee women in Lebanon? Didn't happen, but we could make it happen. Right, Yvonne? We've been talking about this for years, right? The second point I want to make, so we need parity. Mental health still is a sideshow. I'm sorry to say, but it's come a long way. We should be proud of ourselves. It's come a long way since 1981 when I started the clinic. It's come a long way. Okay. The second thing is I'm going to say something radical and extreme here. Every humanitarian worker needs supervision. And this has to be baked into our public policy. We have a course at Harvard. We have 1,450 alumni in our Global Health course going back, working in 85 countries. This came out of our meeting with the ministers of post-conflict. In December 2004, we had a meeting with the ministers of post-conflict countries, and they asked for this training. We provided the training. We have now 1,500 people in 85 countries. Across the board, when they come to our 2-week training in Italy, and then they're 5 months online, they are damaged, they're depressed, they have poor self-care, some of them are even suicidal. Can you imagine this? You know, people working in Yemen in the field, a lot of them are people in country who work for their own fellow citizens. And across the board, so now at Harvard, maybe the UN can work with us. We want to start a program for supervision for humanitarian workers. We want to have a special program for humanitarian workers to supervise them. And supervision is really important because people who are facing and listening empathically to murder, rape, like we work in the Ukraine, we talked about, you know, the stories these people are listening to, the level of empathy, you know, empathy hurts. You know, empathy isn't all peaches and cream. If you believe in empathy heals, you have to believe in self-care. Because you're taking, you guys, you know, right? When you take in all the pain you're hearing, it accumulates in your body and your mind. It just doesn't go away. I've had 40 years of listening to 10,000 torture treatment trauma stories. You know, I'm not quite sure why I'm still around. You know, because that's a lot to accumulate over. And the last point I want to make is based on brain science, is emotional intelligence. Do you guys talk about this in the UN? How we can have empathic policies, because I see every day empathic failure. I see policies that are not meeting people at the empathic level and are not being transformative in the local community, the community we're serving, whether it's our staff, our colleagues, or people in the field. And empathic failure is all over the place. And I see, you know, I look and I say, this is not working for the people. But the policy maker isn't at that level to know that. Can we teach policy makers, I'm also talking about medical doctors and others, can we teach emotional intelligence to our policy makers so that they can bring a well-developed, sensitive, culturally sensitive, empathic response to their staff, their colleagues in the community they serve? I ask this question because when you can just watch the news every day, you see empathic failure is all over the map, you know. And what I mean by that is not the touchy-feely empathy. I'm talking about how, at a very deep level, traumatized people feel they're not being heard and are not being listened to. This is a great failure in the part of medicine, psychiatry, and I don't know enough about the UN and other structures, but I'd like to hope we can have more of a discussion about emotional intelligence and its role in policy planning. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks so much. So I think we've heard a really vast array of views today in terms of hearing about from the global level to the regional level, to the local and community level, to the personal and mental level in terms of humanitarian action, humanitarian response, the state in 2022 of being an actor working in the field of humanitarian affairs, but also hearing about how the multiplicity of factors contributing to humanitarian crises, whether it's natural disasters or elements and new factors that are coming up, like the intersection of climate change and how that leads to more instability and how that can proliferate and in some ways multiply the impacts of crises and conflicts around the world. And also we've heard about how the increasing strains on the humanitarian system are playing out and in some ways restricting and limiting the ability of the international system, but also actors at these various levels to be able to respond and to be able to address these challenges. I think the way that this panel has been structured, and this I think is a credit to Yvonne and your team, in the fact that we've been able to hear these variety of opinions and views, especially on such an important day as World Humanitarian Day. And I think we've got maybe 10, maybe 15 minutes for questions, and I have a few myself, and you might not be able to, I might not have a question specific for each of our speakers just because of time constraints, but in one of the elements that I've been wondering as I've been sitting here and listening to these really insightful testimonies is, how firstly do we start to address some of these challenges that we've really identified today, whether it's the sort of the strain on the humanitarian system, as it were. That's obviously touching on issues like the sort of political environment that humanitarian actors are working in, where there is more maybe hostility towards humanitarian actors on the ground. Also politically, including at a space like the UN and the space that I and my organization cover quite closely, the Security Council. It used to be the case that humanitarian action, humanitarian response was to some degree a untouched and unpoliticized sphere, but increasingly in recent years that has become less so the case. So I wonder, given these sorts of challenges, how, for humanitarian actors that want to continue to help people suffering on the ground, people suffering at different levels, how is there an ability, and how can we essentially ensure that there's an adequate level of resources, of focus to the variety of crises, at least at the international level, that we're all dealing with. So something that you were talking about, how do we ensure the amount of attention that Ukraine gets to your South Sudans, to your Yemens, to your Syrias and Lebanons, and then at a different level, how do we also ensure that humanitarian workers themselves have certain levels of care and protection. But I think maybe to start with, and whoever wants to take this on, is that question of ensuring a certain amount of attention and focus at the first level before we even start to get to action and response. I mean, how do we ensure that the lower priority, less geopolitical crises in the world get that kind of attention that Ukraine gets? Whoever wants to take that on, please be our guest.
Do you want me to perhaps kickstart?
Please.
Not that I'm an authority on this, but since we really do suffer at first hand precisely because of, and Doug actually mentioned this as well, the High Commissioner for Refugees, my boss, is going to be coming next month to New York for the UN General Assembly High Level Week. This is kind of an annual UN jamboree when you have all the presidents and prime ministers on the planet congregating here in New York to discuss the world's problems. And he's coming here primarily exactly for that. It's to emphasize the fact that it's not all about Ukraine, that there are at least 12 other humanitarian crises that are critically underfunded. We just heard some of them today: Yemen, Mozambique, Ethiopia, the two Sudans, Somalia. These are protracted crises. They're no longer considered sexy. And because of that, they've pretty much fallen off the radar of most of the major donors, which tend to be, of course, the member states themselves. And his primary reason for coming here is really three issues. One, we need funding for these critically underfunded operations, because otherwise as the executive director of the World Food Program said to the Security Council, he said, I am being forced to take food away from hungry children to give it to starving children. And that's how serious the food crisis is. And the first to be sacrificed, quote unquote, in this are the refugees, because they're not nationals in the countries in which they are. They tend to be the ones that are considered to be least prioritized, because the nationals of the governments obviously and inevitably do favor their own nationals when it comes to a food crisis. And because of that, the displaced tend to be the ones that are the least served and the most vulnerable. So I think for us, primarily, this is it. It's lobbying with member states, but not just with member states, but also with the private sector, with civil society, the more influential lobbies, to really lobby with the governments and with the big foundations to contribute funding for these operations, to make sure that we are able to protect and assist the people that are actually in need of it. The other thing is, I think, humanitarian access. This has become such a politicized issue, Ashish, as you were saying. Prior to Ukraine, there was still margin to maneuver in the Security Council, where you had the 5 permanent members, who obviously always had deeply entrenched divisions of opinion concerning specific political situations. But there was always a margin to maneuver, where you had the ambassadors going off, having a cup of coffee, agreeing on a compromise, coming back to the Security Council, presenting that compromise for adoption. That margin to maneuver no longer exists because of Ukraine, because the member states have become so polarized that that ability to be able to discuss issues, sensitive political issues, in the corridors of the UN and to arrive at a compromise are no longer there. So for us, again, the first victims of this are the humanitarian workers, the safety of the humanitarian personnel, but also humanitarian access. In other words, access for our colleagues to be able to actually assist and protect the people in need. So these are kind of the 3 principal issues: safety of humanitarian personnel, humanitarian access, and humanitarian funding. And for us, these are really the 3 basic priorities.
Thanks. Just add something quickly, because when you were speaking, I was thinking about my experience here in Vermont during COVID of things changing so radically so quickly, particularly with funders, and how funders started behaving differently. And we were able to see things happening that we didn't think were possible. And one of the things I'm trying to do at the state level is kind of keep that momentum going, reminding people that we were able to do things. We were able to do things that we didn't think we could do. Funders changed the way they funded. They reduced the amount of restrictions on their funding. They were able to see beyond the goals they had set up for their foundations. And I'm sure that's happening at the national and international level too. So how do we keep reminding people about what we've already done and what the possible is, and that we should keep that momentum going?
It was fascinating to say that, John, because that was an issue I was going to touch on and also pose to all of you, which is in the international context, especially since the Ukraine war started, it's almost been, as far as I've seen, the opposite in the context of a lot of the big Western governments, devoting so much of their resources and funding to Ukraine, and obviously the frontline states handling the humanitarian crisis emanating from Ukraine, that they've said explicitly, look, we won't have as many resources to give to the other parts of the world, to the other crises that that we've talked about, and the underfunding that you mentioned in terms of what will be the focus next month at the General Assembly, and that almost seems like it's going to only sort of exacerbate the problem even more. And I wonder again, in terms of that, it almost seems like a sort of a zero-sum environment in terms of the funding situation, and how that will play out given what we know about the trajectory of the Ukraine war, the humanitarian crisis that it'll continue to result in, and the strains that it'll continue to put on European and I suppose American humanitarian response as well, and how it will limit the ability of a lot of these governments who are the big donors to humanitarian responses. So I wonder how that could potentially, is there a way out, or is it as bleak as this sounds in terms of the other 12 other humanitarian crises that are very underfunded. I mean, is there some way where governments can do both, or is it really that until the Ukraine war and its impact is being felt, that these other crises will continue to be underfunded?
Well, I think one thing is important to emphasize is there's no humanitarian solution to a lot of these crises, right? The real solution to crisis, and particularly conflict, is peace, right? And so I'd say, one of the most important things to do is invest more in the prevention of conflict. If we can prevent these conflicts from happening, then we'll have far fewer people who need humanitarian assistance around the world. And those that are already in existence, if we invest more in bringing about a peaceful resolution to existing crises, that will help people return their lives to normal. There won't be such a requirement, large-scale requirement for humanitarian assistance. But yeah, there is, I think, very uneven attention on crises, as I mentioned before. But this is something that, again, I think, particularly in relation to the Vermont Humanitarian Forum, this is something people can take away. Is like, you can write to your congressman, you can write to the White House saying, why aren't we putting more money into the crisis in Central African Republic? Or why aren't we assisting more people in Bangladesh? So, you lobby, right? It's all about lobbying. I think the UN does a good job of lobbying to bring the world's attention to sort of crises that are a bit neglected, not receiving enough attention, political attention, or financial support. So I think lobbying, whether it's at the UN level and making sure that all these crises are in the limelight, in the spotlight, but also individuals in the U.S., like I said, talk to your elected officials. They're the ones that determine our budget levels, how much we have available for foreign assistance in the U.S., how much is dedicated to humanitarian assistance, and put some pressure on them to do more.
Thanks so much. Now, I have a comment on that before I open up to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment.
Please,
Sorry.
Go for it.
I think when Doug brought up how everyone reacted to Ukraine, it was like Ukraine fever, and there wasn't enough you could do for this crisis. But that's because people knew about it. You didn't hear about the crisis in Mozambique. But if there were more chances, like, maybe the UN should go on more road shows. That's why we want to do this, is to bring attention to these issues, because outside of the UN, or maybe outside of Capitol Hill, people don't know on a whole what's happening. So they don't know what to do. But there is a lot of compassion, there is a lot of interest. And so besides your ordinary, because most people don't have an access to the UN or don't know senior people at the UN, but they would like to learn more. And I think if more people had a chance to learn about this, that there isn't just Ukraine, and that even Ukraine is very complex, and that Moldova is affected, and other places are affected, then maybe, there could be a groundswell for more support. So I think it has to go beyond just the normal funders, beyond the normal corporate support, and take it out to the people more. And there might be more support.
No, I think that speaks to something that I was going to say, which is, from my organization's perspective and International Crisis Group, the organization I work for, I think this is a space that organizations like us, need to be, I think, maybe doing more on, in terms of filling that space, because our work speaks specifically to a couple of the points that we've just mentioned, which is working towards prevention and resolution of conflicts peacefully, and then second, is shining a light on a whole variety of crises, not just the big geopolitical ones, but also the smaller, less sexy crises. So just in the past week, I've spent time speaking to decision makers and diplomats at the UN about what's happening in the eastern region of the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's the type of situation which won't make the front lines of your newspapers, certainly might not resonate in terms of across the seas in countries far away from Central Africa where this is happening. But these are the kind of situations where I think the ones that are reporting on this, including us, could be doing more to maybe feature it a little bit more strongly. But in a sense, that the market, as it were, for this kind of information, is also reflects these sorts of biases in a way as well, because when we publish a report on the DRC versus a report on Ukraine, the amount of clicks and views one gets versus the other is vastly different.
It's not easy.
Of course, right? Even if the amount of institutional resource that we've devoted to the two crises are about the same. So that also reflects some of the inherent issues in the field and the sort of information space that we're in. But I think, sorry, I'm abusing my position as moderator, but can open up to questions in the audience. We have one from Maria from the Chile mission.
Thank you. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak, and thank you to all the panelists for all their very, very interesting insights. To say this question first, I have to say what I do and where this question comes from. I am in charge of negotiating humanitarian issues at the UN on behalf of Chile. So my perspective hearing you all talk is of course the concern of how do we put this in policy, in a paper where it is actually helpful, not in a way that is perhaps taken away from your mandates, but contributing to it. And I've been listening to the discussion, and I know the urgency is in the response, and that resources for responding, for the food bags, or for delivering food overall, or medical supplies, mental health, the response is already very complex, and we already know for sure that there are more crises coming, and there's more possible pandemics coming, and then you have the climate-related crises that are yet to get worsened, and then demand more from us in a system that's already strained in terms of humanitarian needs. And I wanted to flag some focus that I hear often in UN conversations about the humanitarian focus, because I know in the response we feel often tired and helpless because the politicization of the humanitarian aid sometimes doesn't let us do what we want, but also resources are ever seeming so more limited than they were the day before. But perhaps a field that I've noticed there's a more possibility for agency is the anticipatory action, because usually crises have tell signs that you can monitor, and usually you can predict what are the brewing elements. And I'm hearing, there's a food security crisis, it's already bad, there's ways to mobilize resources, of course, but we can perhaps think how not to let it get worse. We already have the possibility of more climate-related conflicts approaching near to us and putting more stress in the systems that we have. But there's ways, perhaps, from your perspectives, I don't know, maybe I'm going in the wrong way, but from my perspective, I think in the urgency of response, we're moving focus for what we can do in simultaneous manners to prevent more crises to brew and explode in a way that they become unmanageable all at the same time, considering the very, very the scarcity which we are operating from now. So I wanted to ask you if you see, or what ways we can anticipate this crisis and perhaps put these tell signs into concrete action so that we're addressing these root causes before new conflicts brew. We can focus on the existing one, but if we're already noticing these tell signs, then maybe altogether we can better coordinate ourselves or deliver specific actions in a manner that perhaps these root causes do not need to explode. Because it's always easier to, or at least less expensive to prevent a crisis than to deal with the consequences of one. So this is just my question. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I don't know if there's anyone else.
Yeah.
And I don't know if Diego's still online, if he might want to chime in, but I can check as you would.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, Maria, for your question. And I kind of understand where you're coming from, because I served as the humanitarian advisor at the U.S. mission to the United Nations for 5 years, and I was negotiating all the resolutions in the General Assembly and the Security Council. So yeah, I understand where you're coming from. I think preparedness is sort of what you're getting at, right? Can we better prepare to respond to emergencies? And I think there is a significant amount of investment in preparedness, both within the UN system and within governments around the world and so forth, but perhaps maybe not enough. And maybe just look at the crisis in Moldova, because I was just there. That's fresh just in my memory. But I mean, we saw the signs of a pending sort of conflict in Ukraine. It didn't happen just like that. There was a lot of warning, I think, at least in a month or so, leading up. A lot of information, particularly coming from the US government, about how there would likely be a Russian sort of invasion of Ukraine, and then the impact that would have on the neighboring countries as refugees would be forced to flee. So, maybe more could have been done in terms of pre-positioning, I think, humanitarian agencies before the war kicked off into Poland, into Romania, into Moldova, in the neighboring countries, anticipating that these waves of refugees would be coming. Maybe we could have positioned more humanitarian agencies and beefed up staff inside Ukraine to be better prepared. But I think often a problem that I've seen over doing this 32 years now is that oftentimes you can't get the resources or the attention until the crisis is at your doorstep. There's not as much focus, there's not as much resources for preparation, so you're in a better position to respond once the crisis hits. So I don't know, how do you overcome that? Because I think world leaders and governments are so focused on putting out fires that sometimes they don't do a good job of anticipating what's coming next, and then more importantly, putting the resources in place to mitigate the impact of the coming crisis.
And if I could jump in just on that, to make a brief comment, which actually I think Diego obviously would have been in a much better position to speak about, which is I think in some degree, especially if you look at the intersection of climate change and how it impacts crises and conflicts, there might be an element there of being able to use changes in weather patterns to be able to start to, not to a complete accurate degree, but to some degree of accuracy of predicting, okay, we know that there might be situations that might contribute to a drought in the Horn of Africa, in the next 2 or 3 year cycle. So what could be done to start to, create some amount of buffer room and take some anticipatory actions, as you said, to ensure that the fallout from that is can be mitigated. But obviously, to Doug's point, I mean, this almost sounds like pie in the sky stuff, given how governments and the governmental institutions or multilateral institutions are usually designed to act, which is usually firefighting mode. Let's handle the crises that we have, not the crises of the future. Oftentimes, these are the things for another government to worry about, especially when it involves climate and climate change. So there's that sort of institutional inertia that fights against it. But I think there are certain tools that can be employed. And I think, again, organizations like us are trying to also use these tools to be able to look a little bit further afield to see where some kind of preemptive action could be useful.
Can I ask a question about that to our colleagues, UN colleagues as well? Is that, do you in the UN present case studies of successes where you've had big success in preventing a humanitarian disaster? You've looked at the elements of why you have those successes, and then you teach other nations about that. Because also what I rarely see any scientific data on the successes of refugee camps, Palestinian camps. That I've been to all of them, many of them, and I'm wondering, what is the gold standard for how a refugee camp should be run? What refugee camp in the world meets that gold standard? And what can we learn from that for other refugee camps? How do you guys do that at the UN? Do you have that kind of discussion? Because I don't believe, as a medical doctor, you can learn from failure. I don't think failure teaches you how to be successful. I think you have to learn from success. Do you guys do that? Do you look at your successes and share it? And because.
But Richard, I think the short answer to your question about refugee camps and successes of refugee camps, that's almost a contradiction in terms, because the policy of encampment basically means you are confining a vast population within the perimeters of a camp, which makes them heavily dependent on international aid, which totally impacts on their ability to be able to survive outside of that, and which makes them basically completely unable to, don't necessarily equip them with the skills that if one day they're able to go back to their country of origin, they're not going to be able to be independent and self-sustaining. So for us, the policy of encampment is really the last resort. we understand that given sometimes the massive numbers of people crossing an international border, that the host government cannot, for reasons of public order, allow all these sort of millions of people to sort of roam around free, and therefore they do confine them in camps. But for us, that's probably the least preferred solution.
So you have a lot of examples of people escaping from a natural disaster or a war, conflict, coming in temporarily as displaced people, being well taken care of, and then going home. And I mean that you have good examples of that.
I think where the refugees have really succeeded in being self-reliant is where they have been accommodated in open shelters or settlements, where they're able to move in and out, and to a certain extent interact with the host community, become independent, be able to live and work, and be educated in the schools there. I think those are really the success stories and the ones that we have. And just, Richard, just for you, because of the whole issue of mental health, I'm so glad you brought this up, because in the Ukrainian situation, Poland, for example, received a huge number of Ukrainian refugees. There were at least 5 million that went through Poland to get to EU member states, but at least 2 to 2.5 million were still in Poland. And when our High Commissioner was in Poland, he met with the mayor of Warsaw, and he asked him, he said, what is it that you need the most? And what he was expecting as a response was, we need funding, we need you to enhance our public services, health education, etc. He didn't ask for any of that. He said, we need mental health specialists. He said, I am dealing with Ukrainian women and children deeply traumatized by war. They're here, they're basket cases, and we in Poland don't have the capacity, the mental health consultants necessary to provide the specialized assistance these people need. So I think that is really a compelling illustration of exactly what you were saying, that we as humanitarian community tend to overlook that, and I have to confess UNHCR did as well. We did not factor that in till it was really brought forcibly to our attention that these were predominantly women and children who were crossing over, because of course the men were conscripted and fighting in Ukraine, and that these are really people who've been deeply traumatized by the war.
Yeah, we have a project in Western Ukraine for women and children on mental health, and he wants to say something. No, because one of the things I was also going to bring up is that we meet with the Ukrainians every week, and in country through Zoom. And one of the things I was going to bring up is the whole idea of helping people to help themselves around the Ukrainians, the ones we deal with. The teachers, the psychologists, they want to do it themselves. They want the technical knowledge to be transferred. They need the technical knowledge on how to do it, but they want to do it themselves. Yeah, they don't want people from Harvard coming to Ukraine, treating them with whatever, And I was thinking about this whole idea around efficacy is around. We had a project in Lebanon, in Bekaa Valley during the height of ISIS, where the American University in Beirut architects and group there, the Dream Team, they call themselves, they had young people who were being recruited by ISIS build their own schools. So these were kids in primary school building their own schools. Huge success in the kids. We did a research on this, and the attendance at school, the performance at school was dramatically improved compared to the tent schools where kids didn't show up. Yeah, I mean, these kids, I'll show you these pictures. These schools they built themselves, elementary school kids, was absolutely gorgeous. We had a similar project in Liberia where there's one psychiatrist for the whole country. Yeah, and there's no primary health care, where 60% of Liberian women have been sexually violated, where poor Liberian women were able to teach themselves health promotion to become healthy. Huge success. Again, we were able to demonstrate this. And so I was wondering, with the food project, other projects, what does it take, and this is where donors come in too, what does it take to transfer the technical knowledge and skills to the people so they can do their own thing? You see what I'm trying to say? In other words, instead of doing it for them, my old Vietnamese colleagues used to say, better to teach a man to fish than to give him a fish. You know that old saying that goes back to the Vietnam War, you know, so I'm sorry about that, but shows my age, you know. But, so what, I interrupted you because you wanted to say something, please.
No.
Yeah, good.
You see, I think we are getting, we need to look at two issues which are related but slightly separate. One is refugees and one is internal displacement.
Yes.
And exactly because of the reason which Ruben is mentioning, internal displacement is generally a success story. In fact, I remember when I arrived as SRHG in Timor-Leste, 20% of the population of that small country was internally displaced. By the time I left in 3 years, they were all back home.
Right.
And the country is now doing well. I mean, I have you to confirm. They're largely doing well. I think that's why encampment, which happens in camps, and also people who come into a different culture, into a different climate, into a different national environment, obviously have more problems than the people who are still within their own environment. Now you asked about success stories of conflict prevention. That will never happen. It cannot happen for two reasons. The best conflict resolution and mediation, and I speak now as a political person, is that where nobody is really aware that there was any conflict to begin with.
Yeah.
That, to my mind, is the best conflict prevention. The second best is where people know that there was a crisis, there was a conflict, but that they solved it themselves. Only the third best is that we got the UN or the ICG or somebody else to help them to solve the crisis. So generally, most of the work which happens will happen outside of any public knowledge. Now this creates its own problems. It creates its own problems because how do you justify to your taxpayer the money which has been spent over an activity which nobody ever knows about?
Right.
It is a very difficult conundrum. But the moment you start talking about it, actually you have faith in your crisis resolution. So this is not an easy conundrum, but I had a different thing, because since Ruben asked about mental health, and sometimes it has been bothering me, two questions I had. In these 10,000 people approximately which you described, which you have seen, in how many, apart from depression, apart from personal loss, did you find what I would call, let's say, a post-traumatic stress disorder, or a feeling of guilt that I am here, I am still better off than people I have left behind, you know? That is a very strong feeling. And second, how do we deal with something which we don't deal with? Peacekeepers, humanitarian workers, who have seen this on the ground, and they actually keep on working despite seeing it day in and day out. And I think we need to be more concerned, or quite concerned, about the mental health of UN staff.
Oh,
and that is something which is bothering me a lot.
The mental health of UN, I would agree. I mean, they come to Italy from the UN and the World Bank and State Department, and they're burnt out. I mean, whatever that term means to you, but there's a tendency, maybe you guys can, there's a tendency in humanitarian workers to destroy themselves as they help others. I mean, this is kind of built into the humanitarian field, you know, self-destruction, because they don't know anything about the science of empathy and how empathic distress accumulates. It affects your blood system, your hypertension. In other words, they're so empathic and compassionate. These are my colleagues, so, you know, I'm talking about my colleagues, you know, and myself. I went through this myself, you know. They have tremendous compassion, empathy. They go through, and they don't know how to regulate. They're not taught how to regulate empathy. So sometimes, you know, they have to turn down the dial. Like, I had a Congo guy talking to one of my colleagues about cannibalism, how he had to kill and eat his own child, She started vomiting during the therapy session. It was, and then, people in the field, in UN work, they hear what they see, they hear, they experience all these terrible atrocities, and they don't know how to deal with it. And partly, it's due to the fact they're so empathic. And especially if they're from the culture. In other words, if they're nationals, like I heard an unbelievable story of what was going on in Yemen with Yemenis nationals hearing these atrocities and not being able to share them with others, because the shame, also they felt the shame to talk about what was going on. So I would agree. I think my own, thank you for, I think this should be like top priority. This is Sergio DeMille. I met, he was one of our stars, superstars, and I remember when Yvonne was in East Timor, remember when you were there, and I think this should be a priority. The mental health of UN staff should be made a priority, and because we can't function over time, like if you're asking a UN worker to spend 30, 40 years of their life in the UN, we can't function over time and do a good job policy-wise if we're destroyed by the job. But this is true in my own field of medicine, and we know hospice doctors have to deal with this, doctors dealing with cancer, burn pain, I mean, this is all coming up to the surface now, that we have to take care of the people who care for others. What do you think? Does this make sense to you?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I mean, I'm not exaggerating this, really. I mean, this is not an exaggeration. I think we all can remember terrible stories that we had that still leave us sleepless at night, right? We all can remember seeing things, hearing things that 20 years later is still disturbing us at night.
True.
I'm sorry for taking up the time, but
I think we might be close to Yvonne. You had a question?
That's okay, I can pass.
Sure, there's a question. Please.
I have a question, basically for the panel. My name is Sadiq Payed, and I am an NGO director in the city of New York. I'm from Yemen. Headquarters is in Sana'a. And my questions to especially you, Ms. Robin, is that don't you notice Yemen is less in the world media than any other country, especially Ukraine right now? And Ms. Loreko, she was saying that when she told you this is the reason why. I'm going to go directly to you, Dr. Richard, and then you were saying about mental issues. I just read 3 months ago a Yemeni father of 3 children who they were so hungry, they were asking for food all night. He decided to end his life and kill them with him. Now, he came in the media, which is Facebook, for a couple of days and disappeared. But there are so many horrific cases like that in Yemen. But I don't see them in the world media. They barely talk about it. I have not been working in the non-profit organizations or in any field like with the United Nations, but I am a businessman in New York. I decided to leave my job and help and start talking and meeting in places like this. I learned a lot from you guys today. And I'm willing to start, but because I see that nobody talks about certain areas in the world, and there is so much to talk about, and especially children and women in Yemen. You should know that because you are in the UNICEF. They suffer a lot, and the country is just basically plagued with these traditional things and religion and everything else. and they are the one who pay the price. And that's just what I want to share with you guys.
I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that. I was also thinking if all of you wanted to also offer any concluding remarks before we wrapped up. I was also thinking through and I think it was always going to be hard to not talk about Ukraine so much, just because it impacts so much of what I think all of us are doing, across, I think, all the work that we've spoken about and heard about, but also, thinking through, locally here as well, in terms of, John, what you were saying about the level of food insecurity in the state, at the time of the pandemic. I imagine that might have also worsened because of the inflation and the food price shocks that have resulted from the Ukraine war. Obviously, that might be easing up a little bit with the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which is getting grain out from Odessa to other parts of the world in need. But still, I think it's the type of crisis and the scale of which casts such a long shadow that it's, I guess, always hard not to really reckon with. And I think to your point regarding crises like Yemen. And I think one of the issues that my organization and I think a lot of others have been trying to, and obviously UNHCR and others as well, have been really trying to impress on decision makers is that not to forget about the other crises that are going on, not just in terms of obviously the people that are suffering on the ground, but also strategically speaking, one of the big focuses in the UN space. Ever since the Ukraine war began for Western governments, the US, European governments, has been to create a level of pressure on Moscow to condemn Russia for its invasion, to suspend it from the Human Rights Council. And if that really is to be one of its goals in the multilateral forum, what we've been trying to impress on these governments, the Western governments, is that you need to also pay attention to the crises in other parts of the world if you want those other parts of the world to continue supporting you, even if it's just rhetorical support in Ukraine. That if you want support from African governments, show African governments that you recognize how they're suffering from these food and commodities price shocks. Similarly in the Middle East, that you not only have you not forgotten about the food price shocks that are impacting people in Lebanon, Egypt, and Yemen, but also that you're still actively trying to resolve the crises in places like Yemen, in Libya, in Syria. And that, unfortunately, obviously, doesn't always resonate, because people are in firefighting mode. But I think, hearing this level of discourse and also hearing the kind of impact that this sort of a moment that we're in has on the humanitarian space has been very enlightening for me, certainly. But I don't know if you all want to offer concluding remarks, or maybe we can close with that, and I'm sure we'll be continuing this conversation over dinner and over the sessions and conversations tomorrow as well. So maybe we'll end there, but really wanted to call everyone to give another round of applause to our participants.
Thank you so much. Okay, we are just going to have a few concluding remarks from Reverend Cranchfield.
Hello, I am the Reverend Canon Walter Brownridge. It's my pleasure to work for the Bishop of the Episcopal Bishop of Vermont, Shannon McVeigh Brown, who is away from Vermont at this time. So I want to thank first Yvonne and Headmaster Thurber for hosting and putting this on, and these wonderful, enlightening speakers on this critical topic on this World Humanitarian Day. I had some matters to attend to in Burlington, so I was coming in later, and so I'm going to actually let my young colleague here, newly ordained Reverend Bram Pranigfeld. It's odd, both of us, although we're different generations, we're both lawyers and worked in government before we went into ministry. But I just wanted to note that about 20 years ago I worked in Cape Town, South Africa, and was very involved there, as we are trying to do here in refugee ministry in Cape Town in those early and mid-aughts. As you know, there are a high number of refugees from all over Africa, but particularly DRC, Zimbabwe, anywhere that there were conflicts. And I learned a great deal about it there, and one of the things I, of course, learned was from the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who talked about, we in the religious community are very good at that aid and relief that comes for people in need, whether it's food, clothing, housing, and so on. And so he would use the metaphor of Moses, who was found in a basket floating down the river, and talked about how religious folks are very good at maybe rescuing babies in baskets out of the river, but what we needed to be much more involved in is going upriver and finding out why are these babies being thrown into the river. And it is these kinds of events, learning from people who work on the ground as well as who write and theorize, how we in our communities need to be much more aware, and particularly to bring our political leaders the will to indeed implement solutions that can get to the root causes of these problems. But I know Bram has much more he could, in his concluding remarks that he could add to this discussion.
Not really. I think that was beautiful, Walter. I'm not sure I have much else to add. Good evening. My name is Bram Chronickfeld. I'm a deacon in the Episcopal Church here in Vermont. I want to say I'm honored to be here with such a group of luminaries and distinguished guests. I will keep this brief. I do want to just make a spiritual remark. Our tradition teaches that God calls us to feed the hungry, to house the stranger, to clothe the naked, to tend the sick, to visit the prisoner. That in order to actualize our own humanity, we need to take care of each other. We need to give ourselves to those in need. And that our community includes all of global humanity. Now, I want to say I'm in awe to have been amongst you this evening and to feel the import and the urgency that you hold in your hearts for this work. And like John, I want to agree that just being here for whatever it's been, 2 or 3 hours, I feel like I've learned an enormous amount. And so as we break tonight, let's just take a moment to notice this extraordinary group of people that's assembled here tonight. And as we continue in this forum tonight and tomorrow on this beautiful mountaintop, let's continue to learn from each other and to ask how we can work together towards this vision of a humanity that is in peace and a humanity whose needs are met. Thank you.